So in this video we're going to be taking a look at ZBrush and how we can add extra detail to this high-res model that we made. We're also going to look at how we can take this model outside of Maya and then pull it into ZBrush. So that's actually going to be the first step that we need to do. If you remember the earlier video, we showed how to basically take the smooth mesh preview that we had and then convert that into actual polys with this node that you see over here with the divisions. I'm going to leave it at a division of 2. I'm going to select the model and then I'm going to export it out as an OBJ. So we're going to select it and say File, and we're going to do Export Selection and do the option box. And you should see a bunch of different options that you can choose from for exporting. And we're going to choose the OBJ export. And if you don't see this, let's just take care of that real quick and make sure that everybody can see this. We'll go to Windows and we'll go to Settings and Preferences, and then we'll go to the Plugins Manager. So if anytime you don't see particular tools that we're talking about, you probably need to load this in the Plugins Manager. So the OBJ exporter is actually part of the thing here. You should see something that says whatever the version of Maya that you're using, and then the bin plugins. And if we pull this down, you should see the OBJ export, and make sure that's on auto load because you're going to use this all the time. Okay, so that's where you load this at. Again, we'll select it, we'll say File, Export Selection, Option Box, put that on the OBJ export type, and these are the options that I use for exporting. I leave everything on except for the materials here, right? And I do believe it's possible after you set this the first time, you can say Save Settings, and then you're kind of set on that thing. We'll go ahead and say Export Selection, and then we'll navigate and find an area where we want to save this thing off to. So I'm just going to push up. I always make a folder called OBJ, and then that way I can kind of keep things nice and organized for myself. We can see I've already got a Canon _ high-res.obj. Always give yourself a name that's descriptive, so then that way you can always come back to this stuff and figure out what you are working on. Especially if you're working on a team structure, you want to make sure everybody else can view your work as well. So we'll just go ahead and export that thing out, and then we'll hop on over to ZBrush and load that up. So the first time, whenever you come into the program, you're probably going to get this Lightbox that's going to load up for you. So you can open this up and down, or you can hit the comma key. You can see this little hotkey for it right here, the comma key. We can close that and open it. So this thing holds a lot of different things, projects and different tools, which is their models and brushes that you could potentially use, textures, alphas for brushes, things like that, materials and noise. There's all kinds of really cool stuff in here. So the thing I want you to kind of pay attention to is this projects area. I like to usually start off with this default sphere project right here. You can just double click it and it'll ask you, do you want to change the project you're in? It was a default one, so no. So let's go ahead and load that up, and you can see this project gives us it should give you the grid set up and should give you a nice sphere. And if we turn on the polyframe here, you can see the actual divisions of that thing. So you can see at the bottom, I'm just going to click and drag, and that's going to give us our rotation here. If I hold down Alt and click and drag, that's going to pan. And then I can do two different methods of zooming. Let's do the easy one. If you hold down Control and right mouse click or drag, you can zoom in and out. So I think that's probably for new users the easiest way to zoom in and out. The alternate way is if you hold down Alt, you click and drag like you're doing the pan, and you move your cursor in an up and down motion. You just let go of Alt at any point and it turns into zoom. So again, that's hold down Alt, click and drag up or down, and then let go of Alt and it turns into zoom. I'm so used to this thing that it's just a really quick tap, so I'm used to navigating that way, but again, you might want to use the Control right click to zoom in and out. The other thing is if you're using a Wacom pen, you're going to want your settings set up in a particular way to where you could use your pen to just click and drag. So I've got a Wacom pen right now and I'm just clicking and dragging on the canvas here, and that's the rotation. And if I hold down Alt and I click and drag with the Wacom pen, I can pan this thing around. And then I've got it set up to where If I hold down Control and then do the right mouse, which is the top of my pen button where I can use on there, that's my right click equivalent on that. So instead of just talking about it, let's just take a look at these tablet properties that we got here. I like to set this to middle click and then this one to right click here, and this is obviously set to click. This will allow me to use my pen just like I would a mouse, so I can actually use my pen inside of Maya and ZBrush and not have to switch off to using my mouse. So it just makes things kind of convenient. Not something that's completely and totally necessary, but it does kind of help out. So the other thing is, you can see at the bottom of this grid that we've got going on here, and we can turn that on and off depending on if we want to turn on the floor. You can see there's this this little axis here, and so this is the positive direction here, and we got I believe a positive X is what they're saying here. So if you're ever confused about like where you're at in the world, this is going to tell you this is facing forward and this model is facing this way. So the other thing is, we've got this model in here. We can start sculpting on it, so I can just click and drag on the model. But let's look at importing our model in. So let's talk about their setup and what they consider a tool. So you can see under this menu right here, we can click and dock it over, and it should be automatically docked for you. This is what they consider a tool, which is just really a 3D model. But it can contain a bunch of 3D models underneath of it in a hierarchy, like what you would see in Maya and the outliner. That's actually this area for subtools. So in this one, we've only got one subtool or one main model that we're worried about currently, and that's the sphere that we've got loaded up. Now if we want to import over the top of this current model, we can go and say import right here, and that'll give us a dialog box to where we can navigate to something, right? But that's going to import over the current model and whatever the current subdivision level is that we're looking at. But if you want to just pull in a completely different model and just bring it in from scratch, you're going to need to click on this simple brush here, and when you do that, it's going to tell you, do you want to edit out of this 3D model that you're working on currently and switch the mode into this 2D mode. So now if I click and drag out here, I'm like doing an operation like Photoshop. Because ZBrush has these 2.5D roots, as far as like a painting program, you can do both 3D objects in here and some 2D painting with depth, right? You're probably not going to care about the 2.5D with depth stuff, but you do have to deal with it to a degree. You have to know that when your cursor turns white like this, you're not in the mode of actually sculpting on a 3D object, you're in this 2.5D mode. And if you want to clear out any kind of gunk or whatever you want to consider on your canvas, just hit Control N, and that'll clear it out, right? And so now we're on this simple brush, our canvas is cleared out. Now we can say import, and then now let's go ahead and we'll navigate to where this information sits. So I know I've got my thing sitting here, and I'm going to go into this area right in here, OBJ, and I'm going to take my high-res object that we exported out and import that thing in. And you can see my cursor is still white, and I can click and drag this on to the canvas. And you can see it's still in this weird 2.5D mode, but I'm using a 3D model as like brush strokes, right? And it's got this depth information to it. So again, if you ever get in this mode and you're like, what the heck is going on, just hit Control N, you can clear the canvas. Just click and drag out one copy of this thing, and then you can go into this edit mode right here, or you can tap T. And then your cursor turns red, and you can see now we've got a 3D object that we're starting to work with. So just know that whenever you start off in ZBrush, it's not like most other 3D programs where you are working directly on the 3D model. You have these options to switch back and forth between a 2.5D mode and a 3D mode. And again, like I said, probably you're not going to care much about the 2.5D thing, but you do at least need to know the way the program operates so it doesn't kind of freak you out whenever you get into those situations. Okay, so here's our model as we pulled it in, and I wanted to show you that's the fresh way of pulling something in. Or we could import this in directly over the sphere that we've got. So if we've got the sphere and we want to import that in, and we choose our Canon, our high-res object, hit OK, it's going to tell you, it's going to think, do you want to transfer the detail from this sphere mesh or whatever to this other mesh? We don't want that. We just want the model brought in. Because it is possible to change your topology in another program and bring those things in. It's also possible to update your UVs in another program and bring those in. And in those cases, that's where you want to import over the top of something that's already existing. So you might have already added subdivision levels to a model, done some sculpting on it, and then if you update the UVs on the lowest subdivision level in a different program, you can always import those back in and just update the information. Something else about importing, let's look at the preferences real quick, and we're going to do import, export. And these are the settings that I've found for importing to make sure that the model comes in oriented correctly, that if I have any kind of selection sets or anything like that set up inside of Maya, that those things pull over. And then if I want to export out of ZBrush and I want to put that back into Maya or some other program, these are the options that I need to get the correct orientation on there. So I think you're going to want to set those up as well. And then once you set those, there's a thing in the config, and you can just say store config. So that should get us all set up to where the importing and exporting is not a big issue. You're just going to have to kind of get a little bit used to it. We can turn on and off our perspective that you see here. Let's talk real quick about subdivision levels. So if you remember, inside of Maya we had a base cage, and then we did that smooth mesh preview to polygons, and it actually gave us two divisions, so you can call those subdivision levels. Now we imported in the high-res model that we had from Maya, but what if we want to get it back down to that base cage? Well, ZBrush has got some cool stuff where they've got this button called Reconstruct Subdiv. It does actually work in most cases. If it hits a triangle, it can't divide down any further, but we can try to do this. We're going to click it once and click it again, and I believe this should get us back to where our base cage was inside of Maya. Now if we have any UVs on this, this might potentially tear up the UVs on this thing, but not a big deal, because if we had the UVs in a different program, we could import over the top of that and get those back. But at least right now we've got one subdivision. We got up to 3 subdivision levels that we can start playing around with. And let's take a look at the variation in resolution. So if we turn on this polyframe, we can see the actual objects here. That method I showed you of holding edges adds more geometry along the edges to hold that edge than it does here. Now that's great for doing the box modeling thing, but when we start to sculpt on something, I'm going to tap B, and then we're going to go to clay buildup. If you tap B, it brings up all the different brushes within the program. We're just going to tap clay buildup, and you can see if I sculpt on this here, it's really chunky, and it might get a little more dense in through here, but it's really chunky in through here. This whole thing is just really too low res to be doing any kind of detailed work on it currently. So I can add another subdivision level, and I'll divide that, and then now we can start to see the quality level that we've got here. And if we make our brush size smaller, we can tap S, just tap S, and then click and drag this slider, and you can interactively change this. Now because there's more geo here, we might be getting this kind of resolution, and then if we come here, it's really chunky, like pixels. So that's something that you have to kind of think about whenever you add this more detail in this particular area along the edges to hold the edges. It's going to have more geo along those edges, and it's not exactly all that efficient, but it works for us. We can just keep dividing up even further, and now you can see we're starting to get much better quality. It's not super great, but it's getting better. We do have more quality like right in through here. So you can see how this is pretty crisp, and then it gets kind of chunky as it gets down into this area. So we still need even further divisions on here to get things to look probably about where we need it. I'm going to guess that's even too low still, but if you keep dividing, it's possible you can hit a limit with your computer for how many polys that you actually are drawing, and it'll hit a cap on there on that. So this is getting a lot better. I think this will work for our particular needs. Now that's the clay buildup brush. We can just look at the standard brush. We can tap B and then go to S and then go to standard right here like this, and we can just sculpt on here like this, and you can see we're going to raise the surface up. I'm just hitting undo. If I tap S, I can get that slider back for the size, and so I can add stuff like this. This is more of a blobby kind of look, right? And you can see we're on Z add currently, and that's going to build the surface up. Now if I hold down the Alt modifier, it's going to turn on temporarily the Z sub, which will carve in to a surface like that, right? And then if I build up and I carve in by holding Alt, if you hold down Shift, you can actually smooth out the results of that. So just with those button modifiers, you're going to be able to do the main things that you need to do when you're sculpting. You need to build up a surface, you need to take away a surface, and you might need to smooth the surface. So that's the standard brush. After using the program for a while, I usually move away from that brush. One thing that I think could be a kind of cool for the detail that we're doing here with metal is using the trim dynamic brush. So let's go to that. Let's do B and then T, and you can see it's basically limiting what we're seeing for this. And then we could hit the hotkey D if you see there, or you can just click it. With the trim dynamic brush, it's pretty cool. It's whatever the angle of your brush is on the model, you can just click and drag, and it'll kind of flatten the surface there. But if we're thinking about this thing being a piece of metal in the world, we might get these corners that are a bit more rugged, a bit more chipped and worn away. So I'd want you to think about those things as you're sculpting on this, trying to get an irregular surface. I'm also sculpting with symmetry. If you don't want symmetry on your model, you can tap X and you can turn off symmetry for that. And if you want to turn symmetry back on, just tap X and you should see your cursor on both sides here like that. So we'll do this, and let's look at another kind of technique for getting some texture. We don't want to go too crazy with this, but on this one I will put it on the standard brush again. So we'll do B and then S for standard, and then we've got this. We can hit T or just click this. Now our normal stroke that we're doing is this set to this dot, or you can do freehand, which is just basically like you click and drag and it's a line. And that makes sense. The one I want us to look at is called drag rectangle. So if you go here in our stroke type and go to drag rectangle, it lets you click and drag and pull something out. Now that doesn't look all that special until we actually choose an alpha to work with this thing. So I'm going to go to the alpha right in here and click, and then we'll get something that is more like kind of maybe dirt or kind of noise or something like that. So let's just go ahead and use this alpha 31. We'll go ahead and try that, and then we can click and drag out this thing, and you can see the kind of detail that it's pulling out. Now there's a few problems with this. We click and drag out and it's really obvious to see that this is like this stamp that we're pulling out. Now we can fix some of that. We can go to alpha and we can go to modify right in here, and there's this thing called radial fade. If we click and drag that over, you can see it takes that square alpha that we have and it kind of fades it out along the edges, and then now we can kind of click and drag that out and we would be able to get different detail and don't see that edge that we would have on there. Now depending on your surface quality, that feels really heavy-handed to me. So we're clicking and dragging out, remember if we hold on Alt we can dig in instead of going out, but we also have an intensity for stuff. So there's this Z intensity, which is, you know, the Z depth of something. We can click and drag that over, or we can tap U and get the slider on there, and we can drop that thing down, and maybe we just want a little bit of texture on this thing here, like this. Again, if it's too heavy there, you can hold down Shift on any of your brushes at any time, hold down Shift and then click and drag or draw, and it's going to smooth out that surface for us. Let's look real quick inside of Photoshop and view a way to take an image out of Photoshop and pull it into ZBrush as something that we can use as one of our stamps. So this is pretty simple. I just went on to Google and did an image search for some type of metal. Now this thing has got a little bit of color information on it. You can potentially leave that if you wanted to. Size wise, I could do something like 1024 by 1024. Let's go ahead and leave that like this where it's at, and then we can just save this thing out, and I'll just save it to desktop real quick just to make things a little bit easier. And let's go ahead and make this a Photoshop document. There's different file formats that you can save as, BMP, I think JPEG. Photoshop, a flattened Photoshop file will actually work as well. So just call this metal stamp, something like that, whatever you want to call the name. I'll save this out, and then let's hop on back over to ZBrush. And then now for this brush alpha, I'm just going to go to this import section right here like this, and I'll go to the desktop again and find that metal stamp. And we've got this image now that we can use within our drag rectangle. Again, I don't want it to drag out and do the thing that we saw before where it's going to make those harsh edges. So let's just go ahead and come to the alpha area and then do the radial fade and then pump that up to maybe somewhere around there, maybe 8 or so, something like that. I'm going to tap S and then drag my brush size larger so I can click and drag out. Now you might see this little red line down here. It's actually under stroke, and it's called lazy mouse. We can turn that on and off. We can just see the hotkey for that is L. That does come in handy a little bit later. We're not going to talk about it too much, so I just want to kind of turn it off with this drag rectangle thing, and we'll click and drag this thing out, and I think that's looking pretty cool for the surface quality that I want to get out of this. Something like that. And so I'll just kind of stamp this thing around here and there like that. Let's do this here, add a little bit more detail. Okay, now if you don't see this kind of detail in your model, it's probably because you just don't have enough subdivision levels. And this does become kind of a fine balancing act, you know, of how many polys you actually have on your model to get the kind of detail that you're looking for. So I'm going to put it back on that trim dynamic brush. I'm going to hit B and then T and then find the trim dynamic. And let's just go through and then make sure we're roughening up more of our edges. And it might be appropriate even, you know, to do this this detailing first with the stamp, and then do maybe some of this work on top of it, depending on what you want the look to look like. You know, do you want it to look like this has been rusted over time? And if it's been rusted over time, then you'd probably do these edge knocking off first, and then do that detailing over the top of it afterwards. So it's going to run through. I'm not going to get too crazy with this, just want to get some variation in this thing. Have it look pretty cool. And then the next thing that we're going to do, there is a another brush that we can use that would be used for adding like maybe cracks and things like that. It's a brush that I like to use quite a bit. It's called the Damien Standard brush. So let's just do a few more details on here, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at that one. And I might just flatten out some areas on here. I think that's looking pretty cool. Alright, so let's take a look at the Damien standard. Let's hit B and then D, and then we've got this Damien standard here. And if we click on this and drag out, you can see the alpha for this is a really sharp point. So it basically just kind of drags in and has this really kind of effect, like you've got a knife and you're kind of cutting into things. So I'm just going to add these type of details every now and then. If I can turn off X, and remember we can turn off symmetry for this thing. So I'm not too heavy-handed with this. On this one, it's automatically digging in for you. And again, if you want to build the surface up, you just hold down Alt. So it's the opposite of maybe what you're used to with the other brushes. But this one's main function is really kind of doing this kind of carving and cutting into things. So I can be kind of light with this. Pull it in there. So you're just adding these kind of details like this. So we should be able to get something that works from, let's say, about this distance, which these cracks really work well for this. We can see a little bit of that overall texture, but if we get in close to it, then we're starting to see this quality level. So we need things to work from a far distance, which is the bigger shapes, and then from maybe a mid distance, which are these kind of cuts, and then closer you get the finer granular level of kind of detail in there. So it's actually possible to get cracks and things like that. You could do that with alpha as well. And if I use those kind of stamps, I usually like the computer to do a little bit of work for me, and then I just kind of draw over the top of what those results are. But this will work just fine for doing some of this stuff. And it's up to you to be artistic with this process. Another brush that we could look at real quick is just if we tap B and go L, there is a layer brush, and then this one builds up only to a certain height based off of your intensity. So if I have this set really, really high, you can see it's going to build up just to that height that I set with that intensity. Or if I drop that down really low, it's only going to build up to a certain level based off of whatever that intensity is. So maybe I'll do something like 10 or so, and then maybe I'll just do these little areas on the model that kind of are like little blemishes in the surface. This one builds up. If you want to hold down Alt, you can dig into it a little bit like this. So maybe we're doing some bigger areas on the model that are kind of rusted out, something like that. And that's looking kind of cool along these edges. And again, stuff like this works pretty good up close, but even from this mid distance, you know, it adds a certain amount of detail to things. So I'll just keep pushing along here on certain things like this. And again, if I want to dig into the surface, just hold down Alt, and it looks like it's kind of eroding away a layer of metal on here, which is pretty cool. Okay. So I'm going to continue on this process and just try to finish this thing up. I don't want to do real time for the entire duration of this thing, and so we'll come right back and see what the results are. Alright, I think I've sculpted on this thing enough. Some things that I found that I thought were kind of cool is if we put it on this Trim Dynamic brush, B, T, and then go to Trim Dynamic, if I had some detail on here that was a little bit too strong, I could kind of just run it along that surface and then knock that back, but I would still have some of that surface breakup, but it just wouldn't be quite as strong, and I wouldn't have to smooth out that particular area. So I can just run it along through maybe here and here, and you can see how you can kind of knock back some of that noise that you have here. Some things that might help you along in this process: if you hold down Shift and you rotate, so you rotate a little bit and hold down Shift, it'll kind of constrain that rotation, so you can get kind of, you know, if you want to do a top view, a front view, a side view, you can do that pretty easily. If you just turn off the perspective, you get a true like orthographic kind of view at that point. So just rotate it a little bit towards like the front, hold down Shift, and then I'll snap like that here, and I can hold down Shift as I rotate towards the back. So depending on your camera view that you're looking to get. The other thing that can help you is if you tap F, you can frame the object, whatever you're currently working on. Something else that we can do for our model is do a quick render inside of ZBrush. So you can hit this BPR button. Go ahead and click that and let it render, and this is just what the default settings that it's got, and it looks pretty decent like this. Now I could actually tweak this just a little bit if I want to render, and click and drag this over here, and we can dock that part of the UI. We can go to render properties, and we can turn on ambient occlusion, and I can show you real quick on the shadows. We can just turn up the rays. I'm going to leave that at 1. The resolution, this V depth, I'll put it -4, and that just kind of bumps up the contrast of the shadows so they don't look quite as dirty. Maybe this blur I'll put it like at 12, something like that. And this angle I'll put at 2. Let's just do like 2, a really shallow angle for this. That'll tighten up the shadow that we've got on here. Now we can do the floor strength and this global strength. I put the global strength at like 0.75 and floor strength 0.5. And let's do the AO real quick. Rays, maybe I'll put that at like 32 for this. Blur, I'll pull that down to 1. This resolution of this, maybe do like 2048. And the V depth, just leave that thing alone. And if I do have the floor on, I do have this, and just kind of rotate this a little bit, you can hit Shift R, or you can hit this button. You can see the hotkey for that. And we'll let it render now at this point, like this. So depending on the quality settings and how high you crank up the maps, it's going to take longer for it to render, but it should have a pretty good look whenever it's done. Now you can see here's our final look of this render, and if you wanted to kick that out, you could actually go to the render passes, and you can come in here. You can see there's the fully shaded. You can get a depth, shadow pass, and the AO, and kick out a mask. All you got to do is click on each one of these, and it'll give you an area where you can save each one of those maps out. So that's up to you if you want to pull those outside of ZBrush and pull it into something like Photoshop and kind of mess around with those just a little bit. I guess the only other thing that I could potentially show you right now is that we're going to need to be able to save this project out. So if you go up to File and you say Save As, we're going to turn off this undo history, otherwise that bloats the file size. You see that we've got this slider here. You can actually step forward and backward in history on this thing of the creation of this thing. Does maybe take a little bit of time to read the memory, but once you kind of have that going, you can see you can just step forward and backward in the history. Now again, that saving that information out with the file does bloat the file size quite a bit, but it is kind of a cool feature to have, to be able to kind of step backwards in time and then maybe move forward through this to see the different changes that you're doing to the model. And I'll just keep dragging all the way over until I have my final one here. And so if I say File, Save As, I don't want that undo history, so I'll Save As and then just go here to ZBrush, and I like to have a project directory, and maybe just call it, you know, I'll call this Canon model. like this, and then hit save, and then it's going to save its own ZBrush project file. So the next time that you open up ZBrush with that project file, it should have the this camera view, and should have the material and everything, and your BPR settings that we just set should be on there. The other thing is getting this model out of this program so we can start baking maps in a different program. So you can see right now, if we hover our cursor over this model right here, we can see how many polys it is. So it's actually over 9 million polys, and it's getting close to being 10 million polys. So that's a lot. And if we want to keep the same look but reduce the amount of polygons that they have on here, we can actually use a plugin called Decimation Master. So we just take this thing, click and drag it over to dock that, because we're going to be using this for a little bit, and go open up Decimation Master. Now if we had UVs on this, wanted to keep that, we could click this to preserve the UVs. We have to click this Pre-Process Current button, and it's going to sit there and analyze the model that we have, and it's going to do some calculations, save out a little file somewhere. It's kind of transparent to the user, so you're not really going to notice that stuff too much. But when it's done, we're going to be able to use this decimate current and this percentage of decimation. So while it's doing its calculation, I might as well sit there and explain some of this. So the percentage of decimation, the default right here is 20, so it's going to, whatever that total poly count is, it's going to drop it down to 20% of what that higher number was. Now you can enter in a specific number, like you see 200 in K, so that means that's going to be 200,000 polys. So if you needed this thing to be, you know, specifically 200,000 polys, you could put that number in, and it would do the best that it can to drop it down to whatever that particular number is. What I've found is I can usually get away with a percentage of decimation, usually around 12%, and then that drops it down pretty good. I want to try to get my models to be around 2 million polys or so to get it out of here. So then you could actually put 2,000 in this number, and you could make sure that all your models are getting kicked out as 2 million polys at that point. Alright, so you can see the calculation has been done, and now we can start to play around with this percentage of decimation. So I'll just put it to 12 like I said I normally do, and say decimate current, and it'll decimate whatever that current subtool is that you're working with. And you can see after it's done, you might actually not notice any kind of change in the model, but you'll have to put it on the poly frame, and you can see at that point what it's done and how it's reducing in certain areas. So it does a really good job of trying to hold the detail in particular areas where there's high detail, and where it doesn't need it, it drops it down pretty well. So this percentage of decimation, you can see it's a little over 2 million. So I could actually drive that number and be very specific with it. Like I said, if I put that at 2,000 right there and say decimate current again, so you can always change these percentages and these numbers, and then after it's done this pre-processing thing, it's you just hit decimate current, and it's going to drop it down to that particular line. So like, let's hold our cursor over this model and see where we're at now. So you can see we're really close to 2 million polys. So at that point, after it's been dropped down and we've got the look of this thing, we can export this out, and we can export this out as an OBJ, and we can do this, I'll call this Canon high-res sculpted and decimated, something like that in the description of the name, so I can always get back to that file and know that's exactly what it is that I'm looking for. So it's up to you if you wanted to save this with your project file. If you wanted to save your decimated version, I'd suggest making like a clone of your object before you did this. So I should have done this before I did this, but I can just show you now real quick. Just take the model, hit clone, and you can see you're going to make an exact copy of it, and then you could run the decimation on that clone, and then you always have your original and you could save the final decimated version with your project file whenever you go to save file, save as. So it's up to you how you want to work, but you know, if you just wanted to kick out the high-res mesh, you would have to, if you want to change those parameters, you'd have to come back and go back to the decimation master at that point. If we want to close any of this stuff up, we can do that, and that's basically going to be enough to get you kind of getting started inside of ZBrush and adding that detail pass to your high-res model that you made.